Okay, so our program today, our presenter is a Yankee Air Museum board member and treasurer, but he's been a member of the museum since 1985. He also flies as a pilot with the Yankee Air Museum in the C-47 and B-17. He's a professional pilot who works for USA Jet Airline based at Willow Run Airport. A retired U.S. Navy captain, he served as a pilot in P-3 Orion aircraft flying in Vietnam and conducting anti-submarine patrols during the Cold War. He has a personal connection to Willow Run. His father worked as a tool and die maker at Willow Run during World War II. He has an interest in Willow Run, and as a history buff, he's done extensive research, which we're going to see in just a moment here, and reading on the reasons why and how Willow Run came to be built. He has written the book Willow Run, released by Arcadia Publishing in October of 2016. Also, another local connection, Randy, our speaker, he graduated from Troy High School in 1961. He holds a BS from Michigan State University in secondary education and an MA from Central Michigan University in management. So here now to present to us how Detroit saved the world, the Willow Run story. Please help me welcome Randy Hodson.
Are we wired for sound? Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, my connection to Troy goes way back. My grandfather bought land here in 1939. Wow. It was a city of 8,000. I had one traffic light. Adams and Long Lake. And my father worked at Willow Run, and he lived in my grandfather's house on the corner of Beach Road in Long Lake. He had to commute out to Ypsilanti every day for his job. But since he was a skilled tool and die maker, he had an unlimited gas ration, so he had no problem making that commute. Troy's come a long way since I left here. I had 187 people in my graduating class in 1961, and 14 of us went to college. Yeah, times have changed. Let me tell you a little bit about the Yankee Air Museum. Right there you see our B-17 bomber. I'm very fortunate to fly that airplane. I just get a big grin on my face every time I jump in there. And if you haven't gone for a ride on a B-17, that's one of those things you should put on your bucket list, because no one has ever said, I want my money back, I didn't enjoy that. And right here you see our B-17, and it's in front of our old World War II hangar where they used to train the mechanics for the B-24 bombers. This is the finest B-17 flying today, and it is just a priceless airplane. But how many remember this? October 2004, 15 years ago, a clear, beautiful day, almost like this. A fire started in that hangar and it burnt to the ground in 15 minutes. We were extremely fortunate to save our flyable airplanes, which allowed the museum to go on. And we give rides in our B-25, our B-17, and our C-47. In fact, on the C-47, if you remember the museum, we do adventures. We go to Oshkosh for a couple nights to see the air show. We go to Traverse City and drink lots of wine. Not the pilots, but the passengers. And other places. So it's all available on the Yankee Air Museum website. But back in 2009, we bought a school at Willow Run. This was the old mechanic school at Willow Run, and it allowed the museum to get back in business. But one of the other things we did, this is the B-24 bomber plant at Willow Run. These are the doors the airplanes came out of during the war. We have purchased that building. And when you go inside this building, it doesn't look much different than it did in 1945. You can see right down through the center of the floor here is the track where the B-24 bombers were pulled through the factory, where they moved one station every hour. And this is the book I wrote. I'll be selling these books after the presentation. They're $25 each. I'll autograph them to anybody you want for Christmas presents, whatever it is. All the money goes 100% to the museum for their operations and their future. This is an ad Ford took out towards the end of the war. It shows the B-24 bomber factory and the thousands of B-24s flying over the factory. It was truly one of the production miracles of the world. Ford Motor Company took on one of the most complex machines in the world, and said they could build one 4-engine bomber an hour. And they pulled it off. But right here is the B-24 bomber. This, at the time it was designed, was the most advanced bomber in the world. It could fly farther than the B-17, it could carry more than a B-17, and it was faster than a B-17. The Army wanted these by the tens of thousands. But we must never forget what the B-24 was designed to do. It was called the Liberator because it was designed to liberate occupied countries. And one of the most hazardous duties you could have in World War II was to be a crew member on one of these bombers flying over Europe. The losses of the bomber crews exceeded the losses of any armed forces units up until 1944. And having flown with a crew on my airplane in Vietnam, you get very, very close to these guys. These become family to you. But this B-24 would just be an expensive collection of nuts and bolts if it wasn't for these guys that animated it and put it to use. And these guys have to be remembered. But when we talk about building the B-24 bomber, I start my book out with how Detroit saved the world. And a lot of people say that's kind of a stretch in the truth, isn't it? But it really wasn't. The U.S. was ahead of the world in mass production in 1940. And largely due to this guy right here, Henry Ford with his first car and his 10 millionth Model T. Mass production had been done at other places before Henry Ford, but Henry Ford revolutionized manufacturing. This is a picture of the Paquette plant down in Detroit. It's still there. It's still open to the public. And he was building the Ford Model R. The Model R sold for about $1,800, which was about 5 times the annual wage in the country at that time. And they built 25 of these a week. A mechanic would build a car, he'd go over here and get a wheel, put that on, then he'd go over here and get a fender and put it on. And it was a long, laborious process to build this. But Henry Ford revolutionized manufacturing. He went to standardized parts with very tight tolerances that were interchangeable. He went to specialized labor. You only put the wheel on one car when it comes by. Interchangeable parts, semi-skilled labor that could put these cars together, and within a short time, he was building cars that his employees could buy for $250. By 1918, 50% of the cars in the U.S. were built by Henry Ford. But Henry Ford was a little stuck in his ways. He did not want to change the Model T. And he had a man working for him, we'll talk about again, named Bill Knutson, that said, you better start modifying this Model T because people want colors. They want change. And Henry Ford said, they'll buy my Model T the way it is or they won't buy a car at all. So Knutson went to work for General Motors, and within 2 years, Chevrolet surpassed Ford, and Bill Knutson became the president of General Motors. And one of the things General Motors did that moved manufacturing to the next level was they had the model changeover. That meant we had to redesign our car every year, change the tooling, change the manufacturing. This gave the U.S. such tremendous flexibility that when the war came and they said, stop building those cars and build Jeeps, within 2 weeks they were building Jeeps. Right here you see a layout at the Louisville Auto Show, and General Motors had the 5 cars, Chevy, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, up to Cadillac. And that was their stair-step model. Right here, this is a picture of my father with his 1939 hopped-up Ford. He was a graduate of the Ford Trade School, a tool and die maker. He worked at Willow Run from February of 1942 till June of 1945 as a tool maker. And he was one of the secret weapons the U.S. had in World War II. That sounds kind of strange, but the U.S. had the most mechanically literate population in the world. The high school kids, the kids on the farm, they all knew what a socket set was, they all knew what a monkey wrench was, and they could work on or fix anything. That was a tremendous advantage for the U.S. World War I came. The U.S. got involved late in World War I. And when President Wilson declared war, the mobilization came out of Washington. And it was run by politicians. And it didn't go as well as it was supposed to. Imagine that. So Wilson formed the War Industries Board. And he brought in Wall Street financiers who understood manufacturing, business, etc., to straighten it out. And a man right here, you see his picture, named Bernard Baruch. By late 1918, mobilization had started to take place. U.S. weapons were coming off the assembly lines, but by then the war in Europe was over. The U.S. forces fought with French machine guns, British tanks, French airplanes. Very little U.S. equipment went over to Europe. There was a man watching all this happen. His name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He and Baruch became very, very good friends, and this would have a major impact on the U.S. when they mobilized for World War II. When the war ended, Congress wanted to cut down the defense spending, so they immediately canceled contracts. DuPont said, you said to build 5 powder factories. We spent $35 million building powder factories, and now you tell us you're not going to buy any powder? That's right. You made a bad business decision. There was no war for the powder. Oh, and by the way, we want you to destroy those buildings. You see an empty factory here. In order to ensure that we would never, ever become involved in a war again, we would get rid of the military and the ability to manufacture arms. That way we would never fight a war again. So Congress passed laws. If you own equipment that's used to manufacture weapons of war, you cannot depreciate it, and it must be taxed at full value as long as you own it. Within 90 days, Bethlehem Steel, the largest arm producer in the country, had destroyed every capability of manufacturing arms. But we were in an era of world peace. There would never be another war. We could just... (1928), this guy, Joseph Stalin, comes to power in Russia. He wants to build 100,000 tanks and 100,000 airplanes. He destroys the Soviet economy and kills millions and millions of people with the disruption of food production. The Japanese invade Manchuria to get supplies to build up their military. Mussolini starts moving down into Ethiopia. So they assign a major on the staff in Washington, D.C. named Dwight Eisenhower. And he spends a year going around the country looking at what would have to be done to mobilize the U.S. In fact, this was his first real exposure to what he would later call the military-industrial complex. And he said, in order to test our mobilization, we have to buy some stuff. We call them education orders. Chrysler, build us one tank. Tell us what you need, how much it'll cost, how fast you can build them. But we were in a depression and didn't have any money, so we didn't do any educational orders to test our mobilization. Then this guy came to power in Germany. He scolded his ministers on not spending enough on the military. He wanted a total wartime economy to build up the German military. And the guy standing right next to him here is Hermann Göring. He gave him a blank check to build the best air force in the world. And by 1937, the Luftwaffe had almost 7,000 modern airplanes that blackmailed all the countries of Europe with their capability. President Roosevelt went to Congress in 1936 and said, we must build up our military. We need to build up an air force. But we were an isolationist nation, and Congress said, no. We need more saddles for the horses in Wyoming. That's the important thing for the country right now. But then, November of 1938, you see this broken leather goods store. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. The Germans burnt synagogues, Jewish homes, businesses, killed 90 Jews, and put 100,000 in concentration camps. Roosevelt, being the consummate politician, said, I'm going to Congress the next day and asked for some airplanes. So he goes to Congress the next day, and he asks for 10,000 airplanes. Congress debates for 7 months, and he elects to buy 5,500 airplanes over the next 5 years. By the summer of 1939, the orders are going out for the airplanes. But by September of 39, the Germans rolled into Poland. And you see the German soldier here with the sign showing the Warsaw. Not much happens in the U.S. This is a European problem. We don't need to get involved in what's going on overseas. And besides, it was the Poles. You know, they rode horses with spears and flew biplanes, and it wasn't really a test of the military. In fact, in March of 1940, the Assistant Secretary of War for Air declares that the U.S. has the finest Air Force in the world with 326 modern combat airplanes. We actually had the 18th largest Air Force in the world, and our airplanes were obsolete by world standards. The P-39 you see here would be driven from the skies in the Pacific by the Japanese Zero 2 years later. May 10th, 1940, the Blitzkrieg takes place. The Germans invade the Low Countries, France, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg. And in 10 days, they defeat the combined armies of Holland, Belgium, Britain, and France. This is the Blitzkrieg. Armor, airborne, infantry. This is a wake-up call for the U.S. Roosevelt wants to get the public's attention. He goes on the radio and he says the U.S. must build 50,000 military airplanes a year. The number was so far beyond anything anybody could imagine. When Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, heard this, he said that's pure propaganda. Nobody can build 50,000 military airplanes in a year. In 1944, the U.S. had built almost 100,000 military airplanes. One of the Air Force generals in his memoirs talked about listening to the speech on the radio. And he was down at Wright-Patterson, and he had his chair tilted back with his feet on the desk, and he heard the 50,000 number, and they'd been begging for 500. He flipped over in his chair and said, blankety blank, what are we going to do with them? So Roosevelt called his buddy from World War I, Bernard Baruch, and said to Bernard Baruch, I want you to come down to Washington and help with the mobilization. And Bernard Baruch said, I'm too old. You'll have to get somebody else. So Roosevelt said, who are the top 3 production guys in the U.S. right now? And Baruch said, number 1 is Bill Knudsen of General Motors. Number 2 is Bill Knudsen of General Motors. And you can all guess who number 3 is. And you see Bill Knudsen right there. He understood auto manufacturing probably better than anybody in the country. He was respected by everybody, well known by everybody. And he was a Danish immigrant that came to this country with $20 in his pocket in 1900. He swept the floors and cleaned the bathrooms and worked his way up through the manufacturing to become the president of General Motors. He was making $300,000 a year in 1940, and he gave that up to become a $1 a year man. And one of the first things he did, he went out to investigate how airplanes were being built. And what he found was they were buying airplanes in such small numbers, it was like a prototype shop. Each airplane was almost hand-constructed, like you see right here. There's no manufacturing. They build one part at a time. And he knew we would never get that 50,000 number that way. So in October of 1940, at the New York Auto Show at Madison Square Garden, after dinner he got up and he had an idea. The auto companies would build parts for airplanes, and the airplane companies would put them together. And he still talked in a broken Danish accent. And he said, he got up and he said, "We must build more big bombers than we can hope to get. We must get them sooner than we can hope to get them, and we must start now. I want you all to come to Detroit in 2 weeks. Don't tell anybody what you're doing." 2 weeks later, they came down to the General Motors building, and they went to the new center building, and the Army was there, the auto companies were there, and the aircraft companies were there. And the Army was headed by this man right here. His name is Jimmy Doolittle. Anybody ever heard of Jimmy Doolittle? Okay. Jimmy Doolittle was the first PhD in aeronautical engineering. He was recalled to active duty in July of 1940, and he was sent to Detroit. He had an office in the Ford headquarters, and his job was, as he said, to form a shotgun marriage between the auto companies and the aircraft companies. And what he did, Knudsen had gotten rid of the multi-layered government contract where you submit it and 15 officials have to approve it, and they went to the letter of intent. And Doolittle set up in the old Graham Page factory in West Detroit everything they needed to build airplanes. And he said to the auto companies, "Go there, tell me what you can build, I will get you a contract." Now, when we think of airplanes, we think about flaps, wings, ailerons. But a hydraulic pump is the same as a power steering pump. A governor in an automatic transmission is almost identical to a governor in a propeller. A giant shock absorber for a truck is like an oleo strut on an airplane. So they picked out the things they could do, and he got them contracts. But the airplane that they needed the most was the B-24 bomber. This was the weapon that would carry the war to our enemies. And Consolidated was building, at that time, about one per week. And the Army wanted this airplane by the tens of thousands. Jimmy Doolittle was in charge of assigning who would build the airplane parts. And he said, "The B-24 is such a complex project, I think the only company that has the capability of building this airplane is Ford Motor Company, because Ford Motor Company had the highest concentration of design, manufacturing, tooling fabrication in the Rouge plant." So he approached Henry Ford in December of 1940 and asked them to consider building parts for the B-24 bomber. And Henry Ford was concerned if he said no, they might nationalize his company, so he agreed to build the B-24 bomber. And what the Army wanted was Ford to build these kits that they'd put on a truck and ship to an airplane factory to be assembled. So after the first of the year, you see Charles Sorensen here, Vice President of Manufacturing, Etzel Ford, Henry Ford's son. They go to San Diego, and right there, in fact, they're groundbreaking at Willow Run. And they stayed here in the Coronado Hotel. Who's ever been to the Coronado Hotel? Okay. The world's most expensive red roof inn. It's got a little crazy. Back in the 70s, when our aircraft carrier would pull into the port of San Diego, that was one of our bars. We hung out there, but it's different nowadays. And Charles Sorensen went there during the day to observe how the B-24 was being built. And what he saw as a production guy who worked in 2/10,000ths of an inch for standardized parts, it was an absolute disaster. They were building aluminum airplanes outdoors on steel fixtures where the ground rose and fell with the tide coming in San Diego Bay. A hole drilled at 9 didn't match at 10. He was watching them hang the engines on the wing, and to line up the centerline thrust on the shaft to make sure it's lined up the longitudinal axis, they had a pickup truck with pallets in the back and a guy with a surveyor's transit like this looking at the prop shaft, and a guy next to him with a megaphone. And the guy would go, 2,000ths upper left, 2,000ths upper left. And the mechanic could put a shim in, 4 hours to hang an engine. End of the day. Reuben Fleet, owner of Consolidated Aircraft, he's pretty proud of his airplane. So he comes up to Sorensen and says, well, what do you think? And Sorensen said, I don't think I can do anything to help you. Nothing I build at 2/10,000ths of an inch will fit anything you build because I have no idea what your tolerances are. Well, that kind of irritated Mr. Reuben Fleet. So he said, so how would you do it? And Sorensen said, I don't know, but I'll have an answer in the morning. And he went back to his hotel, and using his 35 years of manufacturing experience, his notes from the day on building the airplanes, he started doing assemblies, sub-assembly, major assembly, final assembly. And at 4 in the morning, on the back of hotel stationery, he drew a bomber plant that would build a bomber an hour. And he went back to Consolidated the next morning in the Army. The Army said, this is exactly what we want. Start the project right now. We'll award you $200 million to start the project. The largest contract ever issued in the history of the United States up to that time. Based on pencil drawings on the back of hotel placemats. That's how desperate they were for this airplane. Sorensen got back to Detroit, and he had to find a place to build this factory, but he also needed to build an airfield next to the factory. And by 1940, the suburbs have started to grow. Royal Oak, Livonia, Dearborn Heights. So the flat land, you had to move further and further from the city. So he went to western Wayne County in Van Buren Township. This is the Wayne-Washtenaw County line right there. The factory is in Washtenaw, the airport is in Wayne. And Ford owned a lot of this land for his boys' farm, so it made it easy to get the land. And it was by a little creek called the Willow Run. And that's where the factory got its name. You can see the Willow Run running right here. The Army modified the airplane so many times that the factory had to be redesigned 5 times while it was being built. Because they kept changing things. They were so used to the way they operated prior to 1940, where you could call up the airplane factory and say, make the wing an inch longer, we think that's a good idea. And they're only building one airplane, that's not a big deal. So Kahn designed, Alfred Kahn, one of the great architects who built most of Ford's buildings, designed this building, all open, with overhead cranes that could move anything, anywhere in the building, so they had the flexibility to design inside the factory as they saw fit. And right here you see in the spring of 1941, the final assembly lines are going down. They started laying out the runways for the airport right here. There's a little creek called the Willow Run. And originally when the factory was designed, the airplanes would come to the end of the assembly line and be delivered right here. But what happened was they added so much to the manufacturing that the factory wasn't big enough, so they had to turn the assembly line 90 degrees to get more room to build the airplanes. Also, they had already built an airfield here, so they couldn't extend into Wayne County. And also, Ford was concerned after the war, if he built trucks, tractors, whatever in here, they'd be manufactured in Washtenaw County and delivered in Wayne County, and both counties would say, you owe us taxes on that product. And right here you see the turntables in the assembly line that they'd come there, make a 90-degree turn, come down here, go through the paint booth and be delivered. This is the part of the factory that we have saved right there, the final end of the assembly line. And you see right here when they modified it, they just put up plywood walls right here temporarily on the old assembly line. They're building a B-24 bomber behind those plywood walls while the factory is going up. And right here you see the first B-24 coming to Willow Run. This is March 5th of 1942. It's parked in front of Hangar 1, which will become the main operations. Control tower is going to go there. And right here, the first Ford-built B-24 bomber comes off the assembly line. It won't fly for 4 months because it has so many mechanical deficiencies. Summer 1942, the airplanes started to come out, the airfield's laid out there. You can see the cars in the parking lot, production is taking up. And this is a picture taken in December of 42. This is one taken in April of 2016. You can see, other than the modern jets there, not much has changed on the west ramp at Willow Run. But because they're behind in production, and the expectations of the public are not being met, Willow Run is renamed Willow Run. And part of this, yes, the press is very cruel. Part of the problem was Ford took on building a prototype airplane. They had not completely designed it. And Ford went to his mass production tooling only to find out that this tooling I built is now obsolete. I can't use it. So they had to keep updating their production to get up to speed. Harry Truman, he ran a committee called the Truman Committee that was to look for graft and malfeasance in the defense industry. And since Willow Run had been given the title Willow Run, he came out to Willow Run to investigate what was going on with his team. And after about 2 weeks, he said, Willow Run is typical of any airplane factory in the country, with one exception. Nobody is in charge of this factory. The Air Force thinks they own it, Consolidated thinks they own it, Rouge thinks they own it, and this lieutenant down at Wright Pat thinks he can change the airplane 5 times a day with a phone call. What you need is a plant dictator. Nobody can change anything without that man's permission. And what they did, when they did that, they went to what's called the block concept. We're going to build 400 B-24 bombers. We're going to tool up and make 400 identical bombers. If you want to change anything on that airplane, fly it someplace and do it yourself. When you want some more changes, we'll build a second block of 400 airplanes and incorporate whatever you want into that block with no changes. And within a short period of time, production really started to take off at Willow Run. The man promoted to there was Meade Bricker. And one of the last things Edsel Ford did, because his heart was really in the bomber project, was appoint Meade Bricker to take over the factory. And then with his health declining, he pretty well dropped out of the business. They had trouble finding employees at Willow Run. There was no housing around there. The locals didn't want any housing built because it might destroy their property values after the war. So they had to go down in the hills of Tennessee, southern Ohio, Kentucky. And you could make as much in Willow Run as a month that you could make in the hills in a year. The people flocked up here. They were making, I think they started at 90 cents an hour. They could work up to $1.15 an hour. But when you did that and you got overtime for 14 hours, you were taking home about $300 a month. That's $3,600 a year. That was a lot of money back then. And Ford was a leader. You can see right here. Women paid the same hourly rate as men. That was one of his things. He promoted women to the supervisory positions as soon as they were qualified. It didn't matter to him. There was no housing. They had like these FEMA trailers. People would erect these, and then they'd have 8 people rent it. And they'd be 2 4-hour shifts of sleeping inside this building. No plumbing in that building. There was like a trailer park thing in the middle that had one 40-gallon hot water heater. If you didn't shower the first 3 guys, there was no hot water left for showering. The living conditions were terrible. The employees were leaving after 30 days. They'd just get them trained. They were going through 100% turnover a month in their employees. It was just a disaster. Plus, Ford didn't have the blueprints. When Ford got the contract, he went to Consolidated and said, "Oh, let me have your blueprints." Consolidated said, "Blueprints? We don't have any blueprints. We've got sketches, templates, layouts." So Ford sent 240 engineers and designers to San Diego. They rented a pier on the waterfront. 3 8-hour shifts a day, 7 days a week. They produce 5 miles of engineering drawings to 2/10,000ths of an inch a day. They shipped them back to Detroit on railroad cars, and 1/3 of them were obsolete by the time they got to Detroit. Rosie the Riveter, very common thing. We were supposed to have some Rosies here today. They didn't show up. The factory was designed as a 100% male facility. There were no women's restrooms, there were no women's locker rooms or rest areas. The factory had to be redesigned before they could bring women in. And by February of '42, they started hiring women, and by May, they made up 15% of the workforce because they didn't get drafted, they didn't volunteer for the service, and they didn't turn over like the men, so their population in the factory continued to grow. This is the original riveter right here. This is the Norman Rockwell. She's building ships. She's a pretty hefty gal. This one right here was something the government came up with. This is not a real person. This is a caricature of rolling up your sleeve and getting involved in the defense industry. And the women came into the factories. Now, all the photos you see of the women in the factory are what they call glamour photos. Girls, tomorrow we're going to have a photographer here. We want you in your best hairdos and your best clothes when you come into the factory. No more blue jeans and sweatshirts like you normally wear. So you see all the girls checking in there. They look like they're going to a modeling show or something. Right here, look at her. She's got the corsage on and she's working. The original jobs the women had were kind of like women jobs, sewing fabric on the control surfaces, building tubing and wiring bundles, light work. But pretty soon there were other open jobs in the factory, and it turned out there was no such thing as a man's job or a woman's job. There was a job, and somebody had to fill them. Okay? Women operated these cranes. They moved stuff all over the factory. They operated the lathes. You see right here, they're building the cockpit floor. And about 10 years ago, we interviewed this Rosie, who lived in the local area of Willow Run. And she came to work in the factory in the spring of '42, and she stayed there until they shut the factory down. And she started riveting the cockpit floor. And after about 6 months, her inspector said, "You're really good at this. We want to make you the quality assurance inspector for the cockpit floor. And we're going to give you this metal die with your initials. No cockpit floor leaves your department unless it's up to standards with your initials." 50 years later, she still had that. Okay. And this wasn't the women's lib movement. This wasn't coming out of the household. What motivated her and most of the Rosies, they had sons, fathers, brothers, and they couldn't go overseas. But she wanted to do everything she could to make sure those guys on the front lines got the best there was. Right there, you see, there's an inspector going over the gears. And right there is the real Rosie. Rose Monroe from Somerset, Kentucky. I ran across her daughter, so I interviewed her daughter as part of the book and found out a little bit about her mother. And what it was going on, she was riveting the fuselage floor. And Walter Pidgeon, you see him signing an airplane there, a Hollywood actor, is coming through the factory. And he says, "Hi, what's your name?" And she says, "I'm Rose Monroe from Somerset, Kentucky." And he said, "An honest to God, Rosie the River." So they made a movie about Rosie the River, and that's her right there. Charles Lindbergh, famous man, flew across the ocean by himself, renowned aviator. He locked horns with President Roosevelt. In the America First group, he resigned his commission. He was very active anti-war, and Roosevelt blackballed him. But Lindbergh had given Henry Ford his only ride in an airplane back in 1927 when he came back from Europe after flying across the ocean. He and Henry Ford became good friends. Charles Lindbergh's mother taught school in Detroit, so he was in Detroit quite often. So they would get together and talk about things. And they were both ardent isolationists. So when the war started, Roosevelt said Lindbergh will not be in the service, he will not work at an airplane factory. So he asked if he could work for a car company in Detroit, and of course the Army Air Corps knew that that was building airplanes, but Roosevelt didn't, so he said go to work for Ford. So Lindbergh came to Willow Run as a B-24 test pilot. And he flew here for 2 years till Roosevelt forgot about him, and he went out to the Pacific and flew P-38s and shot down Japanese airplanes. Right here you see Jimmy Doolittle flying a Howard. He made the first official landing at Willow Run in October of 1941, but it was after 2 other people had landed there in the previous days because they saw an airport. In those days you saw an airport, you just landed. But he was famous for this raid right here, the Tokyo raid off the aircraft carrier Hornet that propelled him into the limelight. But his heart was involved in Willow Run. Willow Run was Jimmy Doolittle's idea, and almost as soon as he came back from overseas, he came to Willow Run to see how the factory was going. And you see him standing in front of the first Ford-built B-24 bomber, and it's a very rare picture. Here's Charles Lindbergh and Jimmy Doolittle together in the same photo. Edsel Ford, Charles Sorensen, Benson Ford, Henry Ford. But this is the layout of the factory, how they built the airplanes. And this is a page out of my book. And what I've done is all the pages refer to the numbers. So when you look at the page in the diagram, you can see how it fits into the flow of the factory. They broke the B-24 down into these parts and set up manufacturing to put these parts together. Ford went to hard steel tool dies to knock out precision aluminum parts. The aircraft industry said, you can't do that. Ford said, yes, we can, watch. But the problem was they only had 75 presses. They had 4,500 stamped pieces. So they would set a press up to run 30 days production of that part in about 4 hours. Then they'd change the tooling and build another part. You couldn't change the airplane once those parts were knocked out. And you see in the picture right here, we have 2 women operating a press. That was just something you saw in the factory. And right here was the heart and soul of the airplane. This is a center wing. There's 43 of these 27-ton fixtures. All the standardized parts are put in there, snapped in place, and then the Rosie the riveters will drive 60,000 rivets an hour. There were 60,000 rivets in that center wing, and we needed a center wing an hour to build those B-24 bombers. And what's really amazing, these girls could do 6 rivets a minute. There is another girl behind there who holds the bucking bar, so the rivet head will be smashed between the rivet gun and the bucking bar. They can't see each other, they can't hear each other. But they coordinated, the vibration stopped, I moved to the next one. Ford, with its manufacturing expertise, said we've got to make these wings identical. So they built this $250,000 machining combine. That's probably equivalent of $25 million today. And the Army said, that's ridiculous. You don't need that machine. That's just a waste of government money. But when they saw what Ford could do, in 17 minutes, this would perform 42 precision operations to 2/10,000ths of an inch, shaping, boring, milling, planing, and they'd pop that out of there and they could bolt parts on that like nobody's business because everything fit. And also, when Consolidated was building the airplane and Charles Sorensen looked at it, they would build the entire airplane, all the shell on the aluminum, and then they'd make the workers crawl inside and run the hydraulics, run the fuel lines, run the electrical lines. And Ford said, you can't build that way. That'd be like wiring this room after you put the drywall up. So what Ford did is they built the side panels. Very easy to get to, put all the stuff in the side panels you want, and then put it together. And right here you see all the front cockpits are identical, all the wiring, all the tubing is already in there. Here is the rear fuselage with the oxygen bottles and the bomb bay set up. And right here, you see the center wing. The landing gear are there, the turbochargers are there. In 5 days, that will be a flying airplane. That's how quick Ford built these airplanes. And you see it about 16 hours later, the nose is on. They're getting ready to put the tail on the airplane. We're coming down here. We're going to put the outer wings on it. And right here, you see Eddie Rickenbacker with what Ford called the little people. Ford went to the circuses and the sideshows and found midgets that were 3 to 4 feet tall because they had a special job at the factory. They had to get inside the wing and hold the bolt there while they torqued on the outer part of the wing. So there was a thing at Willow Run, when you got done bolting the wing on, you counted your tools and your midgets to make sure you didn't leave anything in the wing. And you read the memoirs of these guys, and this was the finest part of their life. For the first time in their life, they were being paid as everybody else to do a job. They weren't freaks in a sideshow. They had a unique capability that Ford needed. And right here you see them coming down the assembly line right here. There's the 90-degree turntable. And right here, 90 B-24s under production at one time. They were delivering 18 bombers a day. They did 2 9-hour shifts, 6 days a week. They couldn't run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because they needed time to restock and change tooling to keep the production going. Here you see the airplanes coming out of the factory. This is the end of the assembly line where the Yankee Air Museum now owns it. And you see the last built B-24 flying over the field. It's got a single tail, and Ford got a contract to build 2,300 of these in January of '45 because they thought the war might go another year. But by March, the war had pretty well ended in Europe, and this contract was canceled. And Ford was told to shut down production by August 1st. But by June 25th, they had stopped building airplanes. Now here's a little trivia question. What month in World War II was the highest draft call-up? Huh? April of 1942, January 1942. June of 1945, after Germany had surrendered, they drafted 440,000 men because people like my father lost their draft deferment because his skills were no longer needed at the bomber plant, and they needed 1 million men to invade Japan. And my father was in Fort Lewis, Washington, preparing for the invasion of Japan when the war ended. And it's a good thing it ended when it did. My brother and sister are probably very happy about that. But that's the story of Willow Run. I think it's a fascinating story. And the B-24, in terms of airframe weight is a B-24 empty weighs 40,000 pounds. You multiply that by the number built, and that's the airframe weight. It was the most produced airplane in the world until 2012, when it was surpassed by the 737. It took 55 years for the 737 to get to that number. The B-24 did it in 3.5 years. Ford built 92.5 million pounds of airplane in 1944. They could have built 130 million pounds of airplane, but the Army literally said, "We have no place to park them, slow down." And it wasn't so much the machines, it was the manufacturing geniuses who knew how to bring all the pieces together to execute a plan. And the time before Pearl Harbor, Bill Knudsen, almost his own initiative, turned the auto companies into manufacturers of airplanes, and the 4-engine bomber was what they needed. And the Willow Run plant is the manifestation of that miracle of production. Without Detroit, they would have never produced the 34,000 4-engine bombers that brought the war to a quick conclusion. And the Army said after the war, the question of whether the auto industry could be converted to production of aircraft was settled beyond debate during the war. Their success left no room for argument. Given the limited capacity of the aircraft industry and the enormous pressure for plants after May of 1940, it's fair to conclude the Army Air Force was justified in underwriting the Ford experiment. Thank you very much.